Hello there and welcome to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. I realize things are going to be looking and sounding a lot different than usual this week, but I wanted to talk about some things that people don't normally get into when they're talking about moving to Europe. And this kind of getup kind of has to do with the first point that I'm talking about here. So anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Welcome back to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and roll that intro. The first thing I want to talk about is how often people talk about, oh my gosh, I'm going to move to the Mediterranean. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to live in Southern Europe. This is going to be the most fantastic, warm, beautiful, sunny experience ever. But they don't necessarily think about what it comes to in wintertime. I mean, I often go into full babushka burrito mode when it comes to this time of year. I mean, I do have a heater on right now, but I do try not to use it. Actually, this is one thing I feel like in Europe, even though you can find central heating, central air, these types of things, I feel like in the US, central climatization units are maybe used a lot more than you might find in some parts of Europe, except for I do feel as though now with summers feeling like they're getting warmer and warmer, that I do see more and more air conditioning being used. But even then, like I know in some parts of Europe, like even for example, Italy or maybe even Portugal, that people have an opinion that, well, in the summer, if you use the air conditioning, then you could get sick, you could get a cold from that. But then also some people seem to also have the opinion, well, if you use too much heat in the winter, then that can also be something that can make you feel sick. These things, if they're true or not, I don't know. I feel as though maybe using air conditioning would be more of a risk than using a heater, but that's just my opinion. I'm not going based on generations and generations of thought and consideration on such a matter. Another factor of life in Europe that I feel is often not really spoken about is the way that people communicate with each other. Okay, granted, yes, of course, learning a language is going to be super important, but what I'm talking about more is that in formal and informal situations, how you speak, of course, you'll need to change things up. In the US, I mean, I feel as though I hear a lot of people talking about code switching, talking in a certain manner when you are speaking in a maybe more professional scene. But if you are in a European country, and this is something that is based on the language, depending on where you are, you'll often find that you'll have more of the honorifics of sir, madam, Mr. Doctor, the master, maestro, professor, whatever you're going to have to refer to the person as, than maybe in the States. I feel as though people speak more on a first name basis. Even, for example, with the assistant of my accountant, if I ever have to have any communication, they'll often refer to me as Mr. Di Furia or Mr. Rafael. And I'm like, yo, no, it's like, you can just call me Rafael. Like, Mr. Di Furia, like, this is like my grandfather. I'm just Rafael here. Like, you don't have to worry about these things with me. But also, again, like, built into the language, when you are speaking in a more formal way, a more respectful way, what you're actually going to be doing is changing up the way that you form your sentences as well as the grammar that you use. You're going to have to conjugate verbs maybe in a different way, or use different words in kind of general to be able to convey thoughts or feelings or whatever it may be when you're in a conversation in a less friendly situation. I mean, even for example, if you go into a store, maybe it could be more common that you'll have to be using the formal parts of a language. If you're going on a more regular basis and they're a bit more friendly with you, and especially maybe if you're in a similar age bracket and you're a little bit on the younger side, then maybe you will have that informal usage of the language, the informal conjugation and grammar. But maybe if you are maybe 50s or older, then you might hear more of the formal language being used. It kind of depends on where you are in life and, of course, where you are in Europe. But unlike most episodes of Not Your Average Globetrotter, where food is definitely a necessity to bring up at least at some point in this episode. I mean, I guess I technically am now. I'm not going to really be talking about it because I so often talk about food in these episodes, and I'm really wanting to focus more on things that people don't really speak too much about. And one of those things, even though some people do talk about it at times, is population density and the size of apartments and homes in Europe. One thing that I often see when traveling, especially by train, or even if you fly over European countries, you will see that there is a lot of open space that is just unused. I mean, you could be traveling in Spain, Portugal, Germany, France, and just see miles and miles, or rather kilometers and kilometers of open green spaces. Granted, there will be a lot of farmland, but I often hear people speaking about how European homes, European apartments just feel smaller and actually would be smaller. I mean, if you're talking about where people live, generally speaking, in my experience, it seems as though people are more drawn towards cities and towns. And of course, that just raises population density there just to begin with. And of course, in historic towns, old, ancient cities, you're seeing apartments and homes and living spaces that are generally much smaller. Of course, yes, you can find bigger spaces. It's not impossible. They'll come at a premium usually. But when I'm seeing some of these open spaces, or even, for example, if we're talking about a new freestanding home, new build, I often feel as though I see these homes that are not maximizing on the space that they have. I mean, there could be, depending on where you are, a limit on what percentage of the land can be used for the home itself and how many square meters the maximum can be within a home there. And maybe they're trying to use it in the best way that they can to get the most out of it. But I like thinking about American homes and how much space you can feel like you have there, whether it's a new build, old build. I mean, granted, we're not talking about living in a place like New York City here. We're talking about kind of the general of like newer builds that you can find, the McMansions, so to speak. In Europe, even if you are finding some of those newer builds, I don't feel as though I'm seeing that same space usage in the same way. But one thing though that I just was mentioning about is about like usage of land and bureaucracy. I know I talk a lot about bureaucracy and I'm trying not to get into things that I talk about so often here, but one aspect of bureaucracy that I feel as though I often really am wondering about sometimes is that you will often hear about food production, ingredients that can be used. Or, for example, something can only be called a certain type of cheese or a certain type of cold cut if it comes from this certain place and is using specific ingredients with specific kind of milk or whatever it might be in the case of the product that you're looking for. And with these specific rules about maybe things that can't be used, about things that are actually detrimental to people's health, on the flip side of that, I feel as though when it comes to maybe even American food safety, like food handling rules and laws, that you don't necessarily see the same considerations being taken in many European countries. I know it's difficult to kind of create this generalization across the whole of Europe, but for example, like I was saying, you see such very strict regulations about ingredients of food, but I don't feel as though I necessarily see the same for handling of food. I mean, you can go to a cafe, a restaurant, a bar, whatever it might be, and maybe you'll see things that even could need to be refrigerated, or at least from an American perspective, you would say like, yeah, that should probably be refrigerated, and see that maybe it's sitting out for the whole day and that it's just being handed to you and it's been unrefrigerated, or it will be heated up, but maybe not even properly heated up. It'll still be a little cold in the middle. Depends, of course, on what you're buying, where you're buying it. And I'm not saying this is everywhere, but I'm just saying I feel as though I see a lot more of what might get a place shut down in the US. But I'm not saying this is necessarily inherently a horrible thing. Of course, yeah, there are certain times maybe I'll be less likely to purchase something. Even if something's maybe been sitting out the whole day, maybe, of course, I'll think about whether I'm actually going to purchase it or not. But at the same time, even if things aren't perfectly squeaky clean, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Sometimes I think in the US that things are overly cleaned, and having a little bit of bacteria building up an immune system, I don't necessarily think is the worst thing in the world. Oh, of course, I'm not a medical professional here, so I'm just a guy with a microphone. Well, actually, today I'm not even using a proper microphone. I'm just using my phone. But I'm a guy just normally who speaks into a microphone. I mean, okay, this is technically a microphone. Who knows? Maybe there's somewhere in the middle where maybe things could be a little bit more taken care of, a little bit more clean, but not necessarily like, oh my gosh, I have to use hand sanitizer every 5 seconds after every step that I take walking down the street. Oh no, whatever shall I do now that my hand sanitizer bottle has run out? I mean, okay, look, is it a bad thing to be clean? No, not at all. But I think sometimes you do see that things can go maybe a little bit too far. But again, I'm just a guy who normally has a microphone. Another factor of life, though, going in a little bit of a different direction, but also talking about kind of the bureaucracy of Europe, is that if you are trying to build a small business here, and yes, I realize this is something I've definitely spoken about in the past, that if you have that entrepreneurial spirit, that the US can be a little bit better of a choice in some ways. That if you are trying to test out something, that you're wanting to do a small business, or you maybe want to do a side hustle of some sort. I mean, okay, this can get into the discussion of like the hustle culture in America and how unhealthy it can be. But even if you're the type of person like me, who maybe wants to have the ability to try something out and the ability to like test something, and you want to do things properly, there are a lot of hoops that you have to jump through in this part of the world. In Europe, if you are wanting to build a small business, of course, if you want to get to the point where you can start hiring people, then you have other things to take into consideration. Of course, social security payments and healthcare payments and the rights of your workers and so on. And some of these can get very expensive, so much to the point that it becomes prohibitively expensive, to the point where you actually can't hire somebody because it's just not possible within the level that you're earning. Of course, yes, you want to grow your business. You want to be able to have the amount of money that you can pay someone. But at the same time, I mean, I've mentioned this before, we're getting to the point where you maybe have to pay out of every 12 months of the year that you technically are paying somebody for 14 months. This is not an insignificant amount of money that you'll have to pay if they're a regular contracted worker. And then, I mean, even some countries, for example, like I believe if it's still the same as when I had looked in the past, that Hungary had something where if you were a freelance worker, you had to have more than a certain amount of clients. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to work as just an independent freelancer, just kind of a one-man band, a one-woman band doing your own thing. Like you would have to be able to issue invoices to multiple clients in a year. Whereas if you were just issuing a single invoice to one single company, then theoretically you have to be the employee of that company. In some cases that actually can work to your benefit, but there's going to be situations where that company just simply isn't in the position to be able to hire you. Or, for example, if you're working for someone or working with someone in a similar situation to yourself, that they might not necessarily have that ability to bring you on as a full-time employee. I mean, maybe even for me, I might want to hire someone part-time, but what does that entail, and how much of that of their income is going to be made up by that part-time work? How many hours in a week are they actually going to be putting in? After a certain point, and depending on what part of Europe you're in, that person gains certain rights and then has the ability to say like, hey, no, this doesn't work. You need to hire me full time. Otherwise, we're going to court. And I've seen this actually in Portugal where maybe someone is working freelance for a company. And then they end up in a whole big thing, and the company has to pay a huge amount of money because they didn't want to and didn't have the ability to hire this other person, and didn't know that they didn't have certain rights on their side that they actually had to make sure that they're covering. So there are going to be some companies that just, even if they're not in the right position exactly to do it, they will be more likely to hire someone. That's a Portugal specific thing. It might not necessarily be for everywhere, but then also, for example, for me, I don't necessarily want to be locked into a certain business maybe as an employee of that business, because that then gives me some less freedoms with what I would be able to do otherwise, and even to be able to grow and to be able to kind of maximize on my time. So again, there are these things, these hoops that you have to jump through. Of course, no matter where in the world that you are going to have these hoops. But I think there are some factors that are really important to overlook depending on how you want to earn your income. And I mean, just generally speaking, when you're thinking about moving abroad, that of course, there are going to be the big things that you have to think about as time goes on, as I've mentioned in so many episodes. But the smallest things at the end of the day are actually what can make the biggest differences in your life. And yes, even though I'm trying to talk about things that are maybe not so commonly spoken about, I think it's important to keep all of these things in mind, the things that are commonly spoken about, as well as the things that are maybe less commonly spoken about. Anyway, before we end off this episode, I do want to say a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis, the rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon or patreon.com/rafaeldifuria, or the one-time support, the rafaeldifuria.com/support, as well as the thanks button here on YouTube. All of these greatly help this project to be able to continue. Of course, if you have any thoughts or any opinions or anything that you would like to share, feel free to leave that down in the comment section below here on YouTube. Or if you're listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, feel free to come on over to the YouTube channel. Although, with the audio quality of this week, I'm not sure that this episode is going to go live on the podcasting platforms. We'll see. But anyway, thank you again for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, a bit of an unconventional episode. I'm Rafael Di Furia, and I'll see you all next time. Later.